Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel.
Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks, what relationship is there, if any, between autism spectrum disorder and violence and murder? So what we see here is a very controversial topic, right? There have been a few articles published about autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and its potential relationship to two specific types of murder, the serial type and the mass type. And we've seen attempts to interpret these articles, summarize these articles, and put them in blogs and other online sources. And this has become problematic because the summarizations didn't really have the depth of the original articles. So this has become kind of a controversial topic, even though it didn't necessarily have to be, because the scientific findings, as I'll talk about here in this video, I think were pretty clear, and they really looked at every side of this issue, and I think we're examining a topic that is important. And some of the summaries were really looking at just certain parts of those articles taken out of context. So this video is about, again, that potential association between ASD and murder, but also about how we have to be careful when interpreting scientific literature, how there's a lot that goes into research, and sometimes it is difficult to take complex findings and really make a soundbite out of it, right? So we have a responsibility when trying to summarize and interpret literature to represent the scientific findings accurately. Now I'll put the references for the two articles I'm talking about in the description for this video, and I'll also put some other links in there as well about this same topic. So I'll get to every part of this argument as best as I can, but first I'm going to talk about autism in general. So what is autism? Well, we see a number of symptoms associated with autism, and there's really two main categories we see outlined in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual under the definition of autism spectrum disorder. The first category contains deficits in social communication, and the second category has restricted, repetitive types of behavior, interest, or activities. So all the symptom criteria for ASD fall in these two categories, and there's some other criteria as well that I won't go over. I'm just going to cover the symptom criteria here. So under the deficits in social communication, we see several symptoms. We see deficits in social emotional reciprocity. So what this is getting at is it's a failure to have what we refer to as a normal back and forth conversation. Also, difficulty initiating social interactions. Another example would be we see a reduced sharing of emotions. The next symptom is a deficit in nonverbal behaviors. So here we see abnormal eye contact or body language, and a lack of facial expressions, among other possible examples of deficits in nonverbal behaviors. The last symptom in this category would be deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. So, for example, having difficulty making friends or having no interest in peers. Under the next category, the repetitive behavior, we see stereotyped repetitive motor movements, for example, lining up toys or flipping objects over. We also see an insistence on sameness and flexible adherence to routines, or a ritualized pattern of behavior. So being distressed at small changes, needing to eat the same thing every day, and rigid thinking would be examples of those. We see highly restricted fixated interest, so a preoccupation with unusual objects would be an example of that, and hyper and hypo reactivity to sensory input. So having a stronger than expected reaction or a weaker than expected reaction to stimuli. So fascination with lights or movement, seeming indifferent to pain or temperature, or excessive smelling or touching of an object. All those would be examples of this symptom criterion. So back to this theory that I talked about before that was represented in these articles and how some have interpreted these articles. This idea that ASD is associated with violence. And again, specifically, a couple types of murder. Well, we see a few examples that have created a lot of interest in this topic, like very popular instances of when individuals have committed these types of crimes. For example, Jeffrey Dahmer. Some thought that he had ASD. he struggled with nonverbal communication, didn't show much facial expression, and he had what they referred to as a mechanical gait. So he walked as if his knees were kind of locked in position. He would also stare at people. He had an unusual gaze. So, of course, Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer. And his case was a very, again, well-known case. Now, another example we see that's popular in recent news is Nicholas Godejohn. So this is part of the D.D. Blanchard and Gypsy Rose murder case. So D.D. Blanchard was killed by Nicholas Godejohn, who was the boyfriend of Dee Dee's daughter, Gypsy Rose Blanchard. Now, Nicholas Godejohn, of course, only killed the one person, so he doesn't qualify as a serial type or a mass type of murderer. But either way, he was reportedly diagnosed as having ASD, and again, his case has drawn a lot of attention. Other examples that we see with ASD would be Adam Lanza and Elliot Rogers. They both committed a mass type of killing. And Adam Lanza was diagnosed with ASD, and Elliot Rogers was suspected of having ASD, although no formal diagnosis was ever recorded. So high-profile cases have a way of standing out in people's minds and influencing opinions, and they do attract the attention of researchers, just like they would attract the attention of anybody. So what was studied scientifically in terms of ASD and violence and murder? Well, I talked about these two studies before. I'll go through each of these studies briefly. We see in the first study that they looked at 239 individuals who had murdered at least 3 people. 55% did not seem to have any type of neurological disorder. 28% had definite, highly probable, or possible autism, and 21% had definite or suspected head injury. Now, the numbers work out to over 100% because of the overlap of those last two categories. They're not mutually exclusive. Somebody can have autism and have a suspected head injury at the same time. So a possible conclusion we saw that was drawn in that article was a significant proportion of mass or serial killers may have neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism spectrum disorder or head injury. That's a direct quote from the article. Now, it's understandable if somebody takes that quote out of context how that could be upsetting. But again, this quote appeared in an article that had a lot of material covered. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in a few moments. Now, the second study examined 75 incidents, specifically murders of the mass type, not the serial type. And they found that 6 of the 75 killers likely had ASD, so 8%. When we know that in the general population, ASD affects less than 1%. So just looking at those numbers really quickly, again, without moving deep into the article, it looks like people with ASD are greatly overrepresented among these types of killers. But that's not really what the article found. I mean, those are the numbers, yes, but the information that the article was trying to convey wasn't about some trend about people with ASD and violence. Rather, it was talking about a potential of a small subgroup of individuals with the disorder who were more likely to be serious offenders. The emphasis here was on identifying this very small portion of individuals with ASD, and the article even talked about a suggestion of a new diagnostic subtype being created to help differentiate this subgroup from other people with ASD. And this is referred to as the criminal autistic psychopathy subgroup. The idea here is if these people are identified, they can receive specially developed interventions that would help minimize the risk for violence. One key characteristic of this possible subtype would be a preoccupation with disturbing or violent content. Now, I see kind of what the researchers were getting at in these articles. I think this is certainly interesting, but I would think that a preoccupation with disturbing content would really always be a cause for alarm. When people fantasize about revenge or harming people, society needs to pay attention regardless of the presence or absence of any mental disorder, including ASD. But still, I can appreciate what they were trying to say in this article. They were really focusing on some of the autism spectrum disorder symptoms seen in some of these individuals. If you look at these studies, I think they try to talk about this subject matter in a way that's respectful to people with mental illness. Now, some of the interpretations of these articles kind of have a different spin on them. But if you look at the articles, they made it pretty clear about the limitations of their studies. We see the limitations mentioned were the use of online resources, which may not be valid. Many people with ASD also have other high-risk factors, for example, being traumatized. We see that diagnostic precision is not very high. So when you're looking at somebody else's diagnosis of a third party, you have to keep in mind that in the mental health treatment community, we're not that good at diagnosing, right? We don't diagnose as well as what's seen in other fields, right? If somebody's diagnosing a car that has a mechanical problem, they're going to get that diagnosis right most of the time. When you're diagnosing a human being with a mental disorder, you're not going to get that right most of the time, unfortunately. That's why it's important, I think, to stick with the same counselor for at least some period of time so they can kind of get an understanding of what's going on. If you just go see somebody once and then leave, I wouldn't necessarily expect that a diagnosis would be really accurate. We refer to the diagnostic problems we have in the community as inter-rater reliability issues, right? So if one person goes to see, say, 4 different mental health clinicians and just sees them for assessment, likely they're going to get 4 different diagnostic impressions, and there'll be some overlap, perhaps, but they won't really match. So maybe somebody's diagnosed MDD, major depressive disorder, with one clinician, bipolar disorder with another, with a third clinician, maybe autism spectrum disorder, and still with a fourth, maybe a personality disorder. So again, whenever we look at diagnoses, we have to be careful, because if the diagnoses aren't correct, and then we're taking that information and building descriptive statistics from it, our interpretations may not be correct, right? The data is poor, so the interpretation is going to be poor as well. Now, looking at the types of murders being studied, this is an important topic. And of course, these murders are awful. But from a statistical point of view, they're rare. So the sample sizes are small. So an important topic, but small sample sizes. So that's something to take in consideration too. We want to be careful how much we infer from very small groups of people. Then there's the whole correlation and causation issue. So if ASD is overrepresented in certain violent populations, that's just a correlation. That doesn't mean that ASD caused the person to commit a crime. It could be that some other factor caused ASD and the criminal behavior. For example, trauma. So when we look at correlation, we have to make sure we don't jump over to causation. We don't know if those variables have a causative effect on one another, or again, if something else caused them. Causation is actually very hard to establish, even with studies that are well done. And these studies, as I mentioned, were fairly limited in their data sources. It wasn't that their methodology was necessarily poor, but the data wasn't very good. So they're not going to be able to infer causation with the level of data and analysis that they had. Now, individuals with ASD are no more likely to commit a crime, including violent crime, than anybody else in the general population. This is what we see from many different research studies. And it's specifically mentioned with these articles as well. In fact, what we see from research literature is that people with ASD may be less likely to commit violent crime. Now, individuals with ASD are 4 to 10 times more likely to be the victim of a crime, which of course is unrelated, right? A lot of times you hear people say, well, this population is more likely to be a victim of a crime than a perpetrator. Well, that doesn't mean that they're less likely to be a perpetrator than somebody else in the general population, right? So we have to be careful about how that's used as well. But here with ASD, we do know they're less likely to commit a crime and more likely to be a victim. So a lot of people are upset with the conclusions drawn in these papers and, again, other people's interpretations of these conclusions. And I think they're upset because the authors made this association between ASD and crime. But if you look at the actual research, it's the authors of this research that report about how people with ASD are no more likely to commit a crime than somebody from the general population. They actually say this in their papers. Here's a quote from one of the papers talking about the findings of how people with ASD are not more violent than anyone else. It is crucial that these important findings are stressed in any dissemination of research regarding neurodevelopmental conditions and violent crime in order to avoid stigmatizing an already vulnerable group. So they say it right in this paper. They say in one of these papers that essentially if you're going to interpret these findings, you have to read the whole paper. You have to take it in context. You have to understand that people with ASD are actually at low risk for committing violent crimes. But many who have interpreted these articles did not follow the warning that was right in this one paper. So what's really happening is people who are writing blogs and creating other media around these articles are reading these articles, even though there's no evidence that suggests they're qualified to interpret the results, and even less evidence to suggest they're reading the entire article. And they're picking out sensationalistic information, pulling it out of context, and then reporting their version of it. So I think the frustration is understandable, but it really should be directed at those who are distorting the scientific findings, not at the researchers who are simply studying a topic and reporting what they found. So I mentioned before, this is an important topic, right? We do need to study murders and try to understand what leads to them. But what's the truth? What really leads to somebody becoming a serial killer or another type of murder? Well, there's a genetic component, and brain injury could certainly be something else we see, as well as environmental stressors like trauma and poor parental bonding. Really, adverse childhood experiences in general could be problematic. We believe a lot of these factors come together, right? So maybe no one thing causes it, but all these things come together and really lead somebody in that direction. So in terms of the mental health piece, mental illness doesn't directly contribute to criminality for the most part. But it may be a factor that exacerbates other problems that we see in a person's life. It makes it harder for them to cope with problems at school, at work, family problems, and other relational problems. So a good example would be narcissism and psychopathy. The lack of empathy associated with those personality traits and the corresponding mental disorders combine with stressors, and this could mean that somebody doesn't really know how to calculate when other people are going to be affected by what they do. They're not going to understand the impact of criminal behavior on other people. That's what lack of empathy would really lead to. So they take some sort of violent action because that protective mechanism isn't in place. If we look at paranoia, psychosis, and depression, we see that people with these characteristics process information incorrectly. They have distorted perceptions. So for example, they may see others as more dangerous than they really are. So it could lead them to kind of strike out and attack somebody who's not a threat. Somebody with anxiety might not build social relationships that could be a source of support, that could be protective. So that would help them to more effectively deal with stressors. But again, without those relationships, they're unable to cope with those stressors in a way that could avoid criminality. Now, individuals with ASD often have comorbid depression and anxiety. So, of course, this can reduce one's ability to cope effectively. And we know that people with ASD are more likely to be exposed to bullying. And we know that bullying is a real problem in terms of violent tendencies later on. People that are victims of bullying have difficulty in terms of managing some violent behavior. Not all the time, of course, but the risk is increased for that group. Now, on top of this, we know that people with ASD tend to have more adverse childhood experiences as well. So in the rare instances when somebody with ASD does commit an act of violence, perhaps a major contributing factor is that they were mistreated because of their mental disorder. Scientists study these topics to try to make life better for people, to try to figure out what causes problems, how to solve problems. They don't do it to stir up controversy. And I think the authors of these papers were responsible. If you read the entire paper, again, as I talked about before, you see that they were actually quite sensitive to this topic. Those that interpreted these articles incorrectly, again, they didn't have the skill to interpret these articles, or they didn't want to apply that skill, they are the ones that are really irresponsible in the situation. They are the ones that are creating more of a stigma for people with ASD, not scientists who are simply trying to get to the truth. Scientists are there to get to the truth, no matter what the truth is. Now, sometimes we don't want to hear it, of course. Sometimes it's not popular to say it. But in this case, essentially what they really found was a correlation that leads to no definitive causation at all, and that people with ASD are not actually violent. So again, when reading and interpreting scientific literature, caution is indicated. So I know whenever I talk about topics like this, and I think in particular this topic around ASD, people will have different opinions, right? They'll have strong opinions on the subject matter. Some people will agree or disagree with me, agree or disagree with the scientists that wrote these papers, or have other opinions and thoughts. Please put those opinions in the comments section. This is really sure to generate an interesting dialogue around this important topic. As always, I hope you found this description of ASD to be interesting. Thanks for watching.